I want to bring in someone who can shed some light onto the investigation side of what's now happening on the ground there. Former prosecutor and trial attorney David Pietro, he's joining us live from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. David, thanks for your time this morning. Thanks for being flexible. We know we had booked you to talk about something entirely different, but in light of this tragedy, thanks for sticking with us. Can you tell us anything about what is likely to be going on behind the scenes right now in terms of law enforcement? We know that local law enforcement were the first responders on the scene, but I can only imagine that now or soon hereafter we're bringing in state level, we're bringing in the feds. Can you tell me about that process?
Absolutely. So on a case like this, it goes from an active crime to an active crime scene pretty quickly, and law enforcement has a very tough job because they go from a scenario where some of their brothers were wounded or dead, and other innocent people are harmed. But this is where the seasoned homicide detectives will come in, the ones that will come in and secure the scene, because right now, even though it's still a horrible event, police and law enforcement and prosecutors are always realize that they have to seek a criminal conviction. So they go from a crime to seeking a criminal conviction almost instantaneously once the threat is eliminated. So what you're going to...
David, what is their first goal? Meaning, once now the suspect, we're hearing the preliminary reports that the suspect is in police custody. So what is their primary goal right now in these crucial minutes after they've got him or her?
One is to make sure the threat is neutralized, meaning is there a second person, a second threat? So once they know the threat is neutralized, they'll go now into, before he will get to court, because he won't be in court for another 24 to 48 hours, where he'll have a lawyer. So now they want to seek a confession. And usually cases like this, as we've seen in the Fort Lauderdale airport shooting, or we've seen in Parkland, there usually is a confession because people are motivated to do these things for whatever reason, but it seems like the spotlight part of it is important. So you'll see a confession that will be sought by a seasoned, the best detective that they'll have, either whether it'll go federal, state, which is this is where early talks start to happen, whether the feds want to intervene because it could be a hate crime, or whether this is going to be a state prosecuted case. You're looking at the potential of the death penalty because of the innocence and because of the level of hate. So you're going to see now really seeking a confession and looking at search warrants. So
David,
where did he reside?
I wanted, before you move on, sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to make sure, so when we talk about motive here, it'll be a while, presumably, before anything is confirmed. How much weight does the confession from the alleged shooter carry? Meaning, if he says this was a hate crime, I hate the Jewish people, and this is something that I've been planning in order to seek retribution, do they take him at his word, or is there further investigation that then needs to corroborate anything that he or she says?
Right, so it can enhance the penalty. So if it's a hate crime and they're seeking the death penalty, that would be an aggregating factor that a jury would want to hear down the road. So obviously, if he's the shooter and they caught him on the scene, the presumption that he's the person is it's there. I mean, there's going to be so many witnesses, but the aggravating factor of the hate crime, the motivation, and things like that still need to be developed by experienced law enforcement, and as well as prosecutors through the search warrant process and going through his electronic communications and other background information to figure out what was the motivation behind this heinous event and crime.
How important is the individuals, if they have a social media presence? We hear preliminary reports that this suspect does. Do they comb through that, painstakingly looking for clues? Do they not necessarily count things that somebody has said on social media as being hugely important? What's the balance?
I think it's the motivation behind it. Now, prosecutors don't need to prove motive. They only need to prove that a crime was committed. But juries down the road, when cases go before juries, they like to hear the story. And the motivation is usually the story as to what somebody was motivated to commit a heinous act. Another thing that law enforcement is going to be considering is, did anybody help this suspect? Did anybody supply him weapons? Did anybody drive him to the scene? How did he get there? Who gave him bullets? And did people give him refuge? Did people know about this and fail to do anything? And now, so law enforcement is going to look for aiders and abettors and co-conspirators or anyone else that assisted in the crime, even in a minor way, as we saw in the Pulse shooting in Orlando with the wife, by driving her husband to the scene and the texting thereafter. So they're going to look to see if there was any other persons that were involved in assisting in this criminal act.
Now, what about, though, we're hearing law enforcement confirm to Fox News that this is not an active shooter situation any longer. Does that mean that they're confident or fairly confident that there aren't other shooters out there coordinating with this shooter, or not necessarily?
I think once law enforcement says that, that's a big statement. So it's probably one that they feel very comfortable in doing, that there's not another active shooter or booby traps that were laid, or his car that he drove in could have a bomb in it, things like that. So I think when law enforcement says that, it's basically they're saying they've neutralized the threat and they're going from a crime to a crime scene at this point. So we're going to start to learn a lot of information, I think, within the next couple hours.
We want to bring back in former prosecutor and trial attorney David Pietro. He's joining us from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. David, thanks for all your time this morning. What do you make of the latest we're hearing from the scene?
I think what we're going to see next is this suspect's going to be put in a room that's going to be recorded, and you're going to have probably 2 detectives go in and try to solicit and obtain a confession from him. And that this is very important, as the president mentioned about the death penalty. The death penalty, you have to prove aggravating circumstances, and it's a lot harder through recent laws. You need a unanimous jury to approve a death penalty. So these seasoned detectives will go in, they will try to obtain a motivation, a heinous motivation as to why it was done. And then you're going to see subsequent search warrants of his home, of his computer, of this car, this Hyundai that they have. And then they're going to look for other potential suspects and anybody else that helped and cooperated. So right now, I suspect this suspect is at the police department, and he's going to be interrogated, and they're going to try to solicit a video statement to later show to a jury at a later date.
We also heard from Jackie Heinrich just now that the alleged shooter shouted, "All Jews must die," at some point during his apprehension. What do you make of that?
Well, now that could be a separate offense. One is to commit murder or terrorism, but if it's motivated by hatred of a person's race or religion, that can be an aggravating circumstance. It can carry higher penalties under the law. It could also bring in the federal government at this point, because now that if it's a hate crime, the federal government might, most homicides are handled by state prosecutors, but if certain ones like terrorism and hate crimes, the federal prosecutors get involved, and he might be prosecuted by a U.S. attorney versus a local district attorney there in Pittsburgh.
All right, David, thanks. If you don't mind standing by, we'd like to bring you back in a little bit later.